Hi, so this is the fourth week of Screenside Chats, and I looked over the forum and picked the threads that had the highest number of votes and activity. And I'm going to cluster them like last week into kind of subsets that I think are kind of similar. So the first set that I want to talk about concerns management, really. It really concerns whether organized anarchy is efficient, which is the question that G. Thalasaram asked. It's related to the question I had on managing organized anarchy, and it also relates to kind of Tammy's question concerning how do you prevent losing a good solution in an organized anarchy. And I want to begin with just whether organized anarchy is efficient and Thalasaram's question. And I think Vincent has a very good point there that in theory, organized anarchy is really descriptive. It's describing the process by which we go through decisions and the fluidity of that process in many organizations. And I think by understanding that process, it makes it more feasible to actually manage and manipulate it. Now, in some organizations, you're going to have much more control over this process of decision making than in others. And in some situations, you have less control. So understanding the anarchy process will at least help you have ideas on how to have leverage in those contexts. So if you want to be a reformer, it really helps to have a great amount of control over the decision process. But in most cases, we don't have that kind of authority. So given that, I think it's often the reality that we have to be kind of either an enthusiast at times where we want to explore ideas and let others kind of represent the problems and solutions and maybe not make decisions, or to be kind of a pragmatist, which is to kind of work these contexts in a way that perhaps makes them slightly more efficient, or at least meeting our parochial ends. So, and we've all been in organizations like that where we have particular interests that really don't matter to others, but when you go to the meeting, you find your interests are undermined, even though it's a very minor one to the other people in the room. So in some ways, this kind of pragmatist view of trying to manage an organized anarchy is salient and relevant to many of us. Now, I think Ron had a nice remark in that thread about it's not always efficient, but it can be effective. Organized anarchy as a form of management. And I think Lottie also had a very interesting set of comments too about how implementation or decision making isn't always the goal. A lot of it has to do with sense making, that we need context in organization where we try to make sense of our surroundings, where people voice opinions, where problems and solutions are posed, and sometimes they don't get related and come to a resolution. In a lot of organizations, we don't even want resolutions of decisions because if we had a lot of collective decisions occurring, the organization would dramatically change, and that might affect its survival. In fact, a lot of our most vaulted organizations tend to be very stable, and we don't want decisions to happen very easily within them, and that affords them this stability that a lot of us desire. I think Nilesh did a good job of summing up a constructive angle on organizational anarchy. He says it's descriptive of many decision contexts and therefore helps us understand how those contexts often operate. So as an analyst, it's useful. And as a manager, you want to alter and lead these contexts in certain ways. And here again, I think it helps to know how the context operates. So you may not have total control, so understanding how it works will help you kind of find leverage points. Now, in terms of managing the organized anarchy, which was more my question, if you follow that thread, you're going to see some really neat remarks by a bunch of people, but in particular, I'm just going to highlight a few. Shirley and Paul are correct to highlight that the process is really about sense-making and developing buy-in at times. And Hubert has an interesting insight that organized anarchies are somewhat more democratic. And I think this is kind of true if you consider that access may be limited to those contexts. So like in certain nations, the government may be highly structured and centralized, but the people in those bureaus or in those committees may be following kind of a organized anarchy within that context. And Giles has a nice suggestion for management. So he says, at the moment, my takeaway for improving my management skills would be to, one, be able to recognize a situation that fit the organized anarchy pattern. And then second, be ready with your issues, solutions of interest in case an opportunity arises in such a context. And then third, don't waste too much resources and energy until the different elements like problem, solution, energy, and window are almost in phase, but just test the water or seed ideas instead. That's Giles. I actually think you can go a lot further beyond that in terms of management. In that I think you can view, as an enthusiast to some degree, you can have decision arenas where you approach them more as a meaning-making session, where you get observations about your colleagues in terms of what problems they think are important, what kinds of solutions they think are salient, who has energy behind which, and the like. So I think you can arrange for those kind of sessions, and people wrote about R&D, brainstorming, a variety of examples of this kind of creative, loose meeting style. Now, beyond that, when you want to be a pragmatist, there are various things that you want to do, and it's kind of Machiavellian in terms of the efforts you have. And you have to keep in mind that if you try to force decisions in a very power-oriented or top-down way, it may haunt you later. The workers may take it with a degree of resistance to those decisions. And the kind of things that you can do, I think, that would be helpful are concrete things, or to constrain access. So things that you can do to manage an organizational anarchy setting is decide who has access to that decision arena. And if the opportunity presents itself with the right set of participants, you can press certain agenda items. The other thing you can do is set the agenda. And there's a lot of things you can do with the schedule of events for a meeting, or even the sequence of which job candidates you vet with everybody, that can affect that kind of outcome. And I think a lot of you probably have folk wisdom in that regard. Tammy actually asked another question, like, how do you prevent losing a good solution? And I think this has to do with agenda setting, really. And you know that the first agenda item gets discussed the most. And often, if you have the right people in the room, they'll attach problems to other problems so that the solution never rectifies problems in that setting, so they can demobilize efforts. But if you put it in the second item, people usually tend to do a little bit better on the second one, it seems. If you have an item that everybody has to decide on that day, but you don't want much discussion, a lot of people put it at the end of a meeting and say, well, we used up all the time, but we have to make a decision on this item right away. So I'd like to pose this, and then it's a quick discussion and usually decided upon. But you need to be wary of those things and use some judgment. If minor, you can push things through and move on. If it's a very serious one that you'd like to decide where there's certain kinds of subsets of individuals that have energy behind a problem and a solution, then you might want to have more time for that item. Another thing that you can do to manage is to work deadlines and scheduling. So here, or the duration even of a meeting, and depends on how rushed you want things to be and how much consensus is needed for the implementation of something. And so there are a variety of things you can do there. You can also manage the outcome by various strategies, and I kind of alluded to one already, and that's where someone poses a problem and then someone affixes a solution to it, and you can argue that that solution creates other problems, thereby kind of eclipsing the initial problem. And if you recall a lot of the meetings and why they kind of demobilize, it's usually from those kinds of tactics. So you fail to have a consensus and the like. Of course, on campus here at Stanford, we do have one dorm called the consensus dorm, where students have housing, and some of these dorms are themed dormitories. And the consensus dorm is where they decide everything on how to live in that household by consensus meetings. And it turns out they run a garbage can kind of process where everybody meets. The meeting starts at 9 a.m. and they have items that are on the agenda, and the meeting goes until they have consensus on the item before they move on. And these meetings end up being 8-hour torturous meetings, but I learned over time that how they actually made decisions was through basically waiting for certain participants to leave. And by the end of the meeting, by 3 o'clock that afternoon, you have 5 or 6 people left. You You have a democracy of the energetic or willing or the most vocal. So in some ways, a lot of these garbage can meetings you can manage it that way. It's quite torturous, but I think there are other ways that you can do this better. The other kind of things to keep in mind is that you can decide things by flight and oversight. And the flight one is that you can table ideas and wait until a fixed problem solve themselves. All too often we try to solve a problem right away, and usually people will if you ignore it for a little bit, it can kind of pass over. Another thing is by oversight, and this is where people tend to pose a solution that really doesn't need any doesn't address any problems. So it seems like you're doing something. And in these cases, what I've seen in a lot of organizations like here at a university is that when there's a problem, if you want to deal with something by flight, you create a subcommittee and you say, fine, we'll deal with this problem. And I'm going to create a group of heterogeneous individuals like you to address it and go off and deal with it. And then basically I've created another garbage can where a bunch of heterogeneous preferences and inconsistencies occur, and usually that committee can't come to a consensus, or if it does, it's usually a while later when a lot of the kind of energy in the other arena might have died down. So there are a variety of these kind of relatively political maneuvers that we've all seen in organizations. But they're all kind of managerial moves in a way, of setting deadlines, tabling issues, of fixing problems in conversation to other solutions, constraining access, a variety of things like that that you can do. Now me if I think about managing by organized anarchy, it's hard to always visualize what an enthusiast is, but I think in a lot of organizations where you're trying to have open-ended resolutions, organized anarchy, or even partial solutions, they can be quite useful, as well as kind of finding out how to enable buy-in from the set of workers in your organization. So I kind of feel like it is a slightly more decentralized style of management. It may not be what you always need for the particular organization, but I can imagine quite a few organizations, particularly those with flat structures and a lot of access to the arena, where this kind of dynamic is quite common, and it's helpful to know how to maneuver that and potentially bring it towards your own interests or the interests that you believe will meet that of the larger group.